Good? Okay. Good morning. Good morning. My name is Jeremy Burton. I am the CEO of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Boston, and I'm going to be kicking off this session with a little bit of framing and a sort of a one local perspective, and then we're going to have our panel come up here with our moderator, and we'll get into the meat of things. First of all, I want to thank JFNA for creating the space for this discussion and for the investment that they are now making in the K-12 space. Many of us, whether we come, in my case, from a blue state or a purple state or a red state, we're dealing with different dynamics, and in the framing of this, in some places, it is about book bans, in other places, it is about deeply anti-Semitic left-wing frameworks about Israel. There are all different varieties of challenges we're dealing across the country in K-12, but we do need a national approach and we need national support for our local communities and local strategies. So I'm glad we're having this conversation. Just from our region in Greater Boston, a couple of examples of the kinds of things that have come up over the last couple of years, and some of these will be familiar to many of you in your own communities. We saw superintendents and principals who struggled at the high school and elementary school level in the same way that college and university presidents struggled after October 7th with problematic or incomplete messaging and then blowback from parents, students, teachers, and others. We've seen situations where high schools allow the students to create a civic learning day designed by themselves that end up with centerpiece films pulled off of the Al Jazeera website with very little context or opportunity to process. We've seen school districts where even when a mayor who's a deep, good ally of the Jewish community and a superintendent who's a friend and are trying to move an agenda of creating more space for diversity in their literature that they're teaching at the high school level, a small group of teachers might organize and go to more radical members of the city council to try to get allyship to bring in the liberated ethnic studies model, which has gotten so much attention in California, to say the least. A Jewish day school plays an interleague high school baseball game against the public school, and the public school coaches show up wearing kfiyahs and other paraphernalia that sends a message. In another school district, students show up for a high school football game to discover that the home team uses concentration camp and death camp names as their call signs for their plays, like Auschwitz, Auschwitz, Auschwitz Hut. That's a couple years ago. And then we have, I'm sure some of you experienced it, local teachers unions where maybe not the union as a whole, but its executive committee has just gone off the rails since October 7th, passing BDS resolutions demonizing Israel, and organizing sessions for their union members that are just completely one-sided and polarizing and dangerous. Or a parent who goes into a school which is also a voting booth place, and they see on the social worker's front door a sign saying this is a safe space for students with all sorts of identities, and it's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, not Jewish students, and they're like, oh, so my kid's not safe in the social worker's office. These are all examples that we've experienced in Greater Boston. And as we grapple with this topic, and you listen to our panel today and we get into this, I think it's worth remembering that there are layers of goals that are interrelated and distinct from each other that we're thinking about. We want our Jewish students to be safe and supported. We want Jewish teachers to have a supportive workplace. We want effective responses to anti-Semitic incidents, and we want curriculums and frameworks in a variety of areas, dealing with Israel, Jewish history, and the Middle East responsibly, providing quality anti-Semitism and Holocaust education that support the frameworks on Jewish identity, culture, and contributions to American life. And there are many different actors in the conversation about K-12 education that, again, overlap and intersect and have different roles. You have individual teachers, staff, and faculty, school curriculum teams, students, parents, the teachers' unions, and there are two different teachers' unions in many states, locals of the AFT and the NEA, which are very different unions and have had very different responses post-October 7th. You have principals and other leadership in the individual schools, school boards, superintendents, state departments of education that provide frameworks, maybe approve textbooks, tools, guidelines, trainings. You have legislatures, governors who have a role in that. And of course, we have the US Department of Education, which, suffice to say, is in flux. So in Boston, our federation, Combined Jewish Philanthropy, established before October 7th a Center for Combating Antisemitism with 3 urgent focus areas: engaging civil society, communal security, and K-12. And for now, I'm just going to talk about K-12. The overall K-12 goal of our Center for Combating Antisemitism is that Jewish students should be well prepared to combat antisemitism when they get to college, that all students should receive an accurate education about the history of antisemitism and how it manifests, and that all students should have strong foundational understanding of the Holocaust. There are other aspects as well having to do with incident response, where we look to partners like ADL, to training for parents and others to engage with teachers from groups like, say, Project Shema, or Jewish teen training to prepare themselves for the high school campus, which comes from groups like Stand With Us or Tribe Talk, which is presenting in another room right now. We want to have content and partners to do with professional development for educators, including Facing History and ourselves, which you'll hear from later. And then there's the work that we as the Jewish Community Relations Council do, in particular with some of those partners, including educational partnerships and advocacy. It's the training, consultations, and resources for administrators, including with some of those partners. It's supporting K-12 parents to help them with organizing and engagement responsibly and effectively with the leaders in their districts. It's working on improving school climate through relationship building with administrators. And it's the policy role of the State House, whether that's working in partnership with our State Department of Education to first enact and now to fund the training for genocide Holocaust education, where we work every year to pass funding in the state budget to make sure that there is money so school districts can bring in partners like Facing History, like the ADL, like the Lapin Foundation, to do effective genocide and Holocaust education. We're very proud in Massachusetts that this year we enacted the first in the nation state legislative special commission on combating anti-Semitism, which is going to be, amongst other things, exploring the K-12 experience and the additional interventions that the state can make through the legislature. And finally, I'll leave you with one anecdote from all of this. One of the things I mentioned at the top was superintendents, principals struggling after October 7th. This is familiar to us all around the country. And in the relationship work we've been doing as JCRC and with our Educational Partnerships Director funded by our federation has been to work with these superintendents to build relationships around school climate. And some of the feedback we get over and over again is like, I don't have the resources, I don't have the right tools, I don't have the validated tools. Where's the good quality stuff on anti-Semitism? Where are the trainings? Where are the resources I need? And everybody's throwing them stuff. And like, as part of the challenge is, any individual can go and Google and like, God knows what comes back. Like, let's be honest about that in this space. And that's a lot of where the challenges come up at an individual level. A school teacher is like, I need to facilitate a conversation about X that's in the news today, tomorrow in class, I'm going on Google. So we're hearing a lot of, show me the resources, give me the tools. I'm an ally, I want to do this right. I want to have a safe space in my school for all my students. I want to be supportive of all my teachers. We worked with our partners in the state legislature to pass new legislative directives this summer to the Department of Education in Massachusetts, which mandate that the department shall make available to school districts, charter schools, approved private day or residential schools, and collaborative schools resources relative to anti-Semitism and societal bias, which will include, shall include, the lawyers on my team get upset, model and evidence-based curriculum, guidance to assist in the selection of materials and curricula, and professional development and trainings on anti-Semitism, ethnic, racial, and religious hate. So we now find ourselves, and I'll conclude with this, amongst the many things we're working on now and we're very excited about, is that in a commonwealth with over 200 school districts, and I imagine many of you are in communities where there are many, many school districts and you just can't cover the field with one education professional, that we now have a legislative framework to work in partnership directly with the State Department of Education to build these frameworks, to have a central location to provide to superintendents the right tools on anti-Semitism, to now work with them to seek funding, legislative or private partnership for trainings for these educators. And that's the kind of interventions that are possible through relationship building, both with the school-based leaders and with the legislature. It's the kind of interventions that are possible when you have a wide network of Jewish and other agencies working on these issues, creating quality content, so that you can come to them and you can work with parents, Jewish teachers, students, whoever, say, yes, we have a problem. We also have some ideas about how to move forward. And with that, I'm going to invite up our panel and Karen Cohen, our moderator, to introduce them.
Good morning. I'm Karen Cohen from the 1-8 Foundation, and the 1-8 Foundation is a family foundation based in Boston, although we are a national funder primarily, and we focus on a variety of things, including Jewish identity, Israel education here in the States, Israel, and anti-Semitism. And it's actually a perfect entree. One of the things that has been really important, I think, for 1-8, and particularly for this work, is to stay close to what's happening on the ground. Because as a national funder, we're looking at organizations that can scale and support these efforts nationally. But the only way for us to understand what those are is to understand what's happening on the ground. And thanks to organizations like our JCRC, to CJP, which has created this Center on Anti-Semitism, we really understand the dynamics on the ground, what's happening in the school systems, what's happening at the State House, so that we can inform our funding, and that partnership has been really critical. So for example, the foundation is very focused on, at the moment, based on a lot of research that we've done, on curricula. And so we are primarily focused on how do we educate non-Jewish students, K through 12, in public schools. And as many of you know, it's very, very difficult, and we kind of took a look at mandates and standards, which we learned, as Jeremy just pointed out, often are meaningless because teachers are really just pulling down whatever they find on YouTube. And we also were part of a group of people, a group of other funders that convened a large group of providers this past summer. It was the first time that educators in the space of Holocaust, anti-Semitism, Israel education came together to talk about coordinating and collaborating. And a few things came out of that. One is that we'll continue to convene that group, and this includes some of the education professionals at the JCRC levels. And another is that we've done two things. We've mapped the space of Jewish Holocaust anti-Semitism education. The group wanted to call it inclusion, Jewish inclusion education is the term that they've been using. And that report will hopefully be out soon. More than 70 organizations responded, and we now have a better understanding of what people are providing, where they're providing it, where they're doing professional development, curriculum development, et cetera. And then the third thing is we are in the process of engaging with a consultant and advisory group of these practitioners to develop a national framework that can be used by practitioners, CRCs, state education departments, and that would include what does a curriculum framework, not an actually new curriculum, because we really don't need any new curricula in this space from our perspective, but what does a framework look like to guide the organizations, some of which are on the stage here, and others, to provide a balanced, comprehensive education to teachers and to students. So look out for those things, and we're really, really excited about that. But to the session. So today's session is designed, we're going to go through 3 case studies with our panelists, who I'll introduce in a moment, hear about their experiences through these case studies, one of which is a real scenario. And then Oh, okay. All, to some extent, are real scenarios. And then we're going to break out and give you an opportunity to talk together in smaller groups in these three different areas, come back and share a little bit more. And I think, if I look out here and someone up here said, I can't believe how many people came. And I think this is a topic that's on everybody's mind. And so really nice to see that we can all bring back this knowledge and insight to our communities. So let me start out by introducing, in the middle, we have Eliza Kramer Elias, who serves as the interim CEO of ICS, the Institute for Curriculum Services. Under her leadership, ICS grew into a nationally recognized nonprofit organization that improves the accuracy of K-12 instruction and instructional materials on Jews, Judaism, and Jewish history, including Israel, for all students. Eliza builds relationships to advance ICS's mission and frequently presents on the intersection between K-12 education and Jewish identity and history. Desmond Blackburn, PhD, began serving as, and I think you're also a PhD, Elite. No, you're not. Oh, I'm giving you a promotion. I'm sorry. Desmond began serving as president and CEO of Facing History and Ourselves in April 2023. Before that, he was Deputy Chancellor of School Leadership for New York City Department of Education, the largest school system in the nation. Prior to that, he served as CEO of the New Teacher Center, a national nonprofit that works to disrupt the predictability of educational inequities for systemically underserved students by accelerating educator effectiveness. And that's quite a mouthful. And then Emily White is the Assistant Vice President of Campus Affairs and Executive Director of JUF's Israel Education Center, IEC. Emily oversees the IEC's program, strategy, and educational resource development, all geared toward increasing student and communal capacity to address anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and anti-Israel activism. So thank you all for being here. And we're going to start out actually with Eliza, a question for you. Our first scenario focuses on legislation impacting curriculum around the country. Connecticut is revising its social studies standards and has incorporated ethnic studies concepts and ethos into the standards. While ethnic studies strives to highlight and share untold narratives of African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and Latin Americans, the practitioners and activists often have a prejudiced view of Jews and a hostile attitude towards Israel. Knowing this, the Federation professional reaches out to ICS, the Institute for Curriculum Services, which reviews the draft and notices that many different identity groups are referenced, but not Jews. And that the draft includes the sentence, quote, analyze how individuals and groups advocate for economic, political, and social change in international contexts, e.g. legislation, courts, resistance, protest, boycott, conscious consumerism. He wonders how his community can be broadly supportive of this positive aspect of ethnic studies while ensuring the negative don't result in standards that exclude or denigrate Jews and Israel. Meanwhile, a Federation professional in Texas is tracking her state's adoption of new instructional materials and is noticing troubling language like, explain how the Old Testament of the Bible had many prophecies about a future Savior that are written as fulfilled in the New Testament by Jesus. There are also prophecies in the New Testament by Jesus. There are prophecies in the Bible about a future where Jesus returns to the world to make wrong right. She's been hearing more about Christian nationalism in Texas and wonders if that's what's happening here and what she should do given the composition of the State Board of Education.
Thank you. I picked these two examples because they represent countervailing trends in education culture wars that are playing out across the country. On the one hand, we're seeing the rise and growing interest in ethnic studies, which is specifically focused on lifting up traditionally marginalized voices in history education. About 21 states have passed some sort of legislation that can be viewed as ethnic studies, but what that means and what that looks like differs significantly, and in some cases can be pretty tame, and includes a state like Texas, which has elective courses on African American studies and Mexican American studies. California remains an outlier as one of a couple states that have an ethnic studies course requirement for graduation. Much more common are states that are incorporating ethnic studies concepts and ethos into the social studies standards. And I just want to say something about the standards because I think the research that the 1-8 Foundation commissioned does suggest that, sort of teachers are not primarily driven by state standards, but I would submit that much is actually influenced by what goes into or what is left out of state standards. And I'll just share one quick example. When ICS was looking at the California textbooks in 2005, we kept noticing that the textbooks were talking about the Hebrews. And they were in the period of the Kingdom of Israel, and yet the textbooks were saying the Hebrews, the Hebrews, the Hebrews. And we were like, why are we talking about the Hebrews? And so what we realized then was that the history social science framework in California only talked about the Hebrews. There was no mention of ancient Israel or the Israelites. As a result, we worked on the next revision of the history social science framework and got them to include ancient Israel in discussion of ancient civilizations. That enabled us to return and talk to textbook publishers and say, this is what's in California's standards. You want your books to be adopted in California, you need to align with the standards. And that resulted in significant changes. And that's just one example, but we've actually been successful in other states working on the social studies standards to ensure that Israel or ancient Israel or the Israelites are included. So it does shape what happens and what gets taught and what gets tested in states. So I want to just explain a little bit about briefly what is ethnic studies and what I mean when I talk about ethnic studies concepts and ethos. So ethnic studies, especially at the university level, focuses significantly on issues of power and a worldview that looks at identity through a lens of oppressor and oppressed. It also endorses activism and has a very activist orientation in which sort of the oppressed rise up. Unfortunately, the idea that Israel is a settler colonialist state is widespread in ethnic studies, and many of the ethnic studies activists who are actively pushing for ethnic studies in K-12 actively support BDS and don't believe that Jews have any place within ethnic studies. We saw that very clearly in the original ethnic studies model curriculum in California, and that's what the liberated ethnic studies movement is peddling in California and beyond through the Coalition for Liberated Ethnic Studies. The Connecticut standards, I'll say, are more subtle, but with language that Karen referred to about advocating change in international contexts and reference to resistance and boycotts, we know that is a not so coded invitation for BDS and delegitimization of Israel. Then on the other side, in recent years, a new front in the education culture wars has opened up with the rise of Christian nationalism, an ideology that posits that America was founded as a Christian nation, is a Christian nation, and should be a Christian nation in the future. Christian nationalists believe that the federal government should declare the U.S. a Christian nation, that laws should enshrine Christian values and tenets, and that being a Christian is important to, quote, being a real American. In public education, Christian nationalists have endorsed a number of different means of promoting their worldview. Since 2023, 18 states allow, or in some cases require, that "in God we trust" be affixed to classroom walls. Going a step farther, Louisiana became the first state to require that the 10 Commandments be posted in every school classroom. While this is being legally challenged, other states are trying to emulate Louisiana's law. And I want to just give a shout out and acknowledge my colleagues from the Jewish Federations in Texas can really speak in great detail and firsthand experience about the dangers of Christian nationalism for the Jewish community, as well as the threats that it poses for the First Amendment's establishment and free exercise clauses. Beyond the supports that I'm going to share, I think if there's one thing I hope that you'll take away from today, it is that irrespective of politics, whether you're red state, blue state, the culture wars that are playing out in K-12 education nationwide are hazardous to the Jewish community and to fighting anti-Semitism in and through education. So what should you be looking for, and what can you do when these challenges come to your neighborhood? And here I'm sort of particularly thinking about the communities that don't have as robust professional development or robust professional staff. Some communities have an independent JCRC or a much larger capacity in staff, and some lucky folks even have dedicated education professionals, like my friend Sarah Winkleman at the DC JCRC. But I know that many federations, there's one professional who is the campaign chair, the community relations person, and wears many other hats at the same time. So I'm sort of particularly thinking about those professionals and the lay leaders from those communities. So the first thing is to know that you are not alone and that resources to support you exist. If you want to learn more about some of the particular challenges in your neck of the woods, please reach out. ICS has developed some background resources, for example, on critical race theory, which we won't get into now, but we've also created resources on requesting reconsideration of classroom materials and some tips and talking points related to selecting fiction for classroom use. Challenges in legislation and education policy can require both academic and advocacy approaches. ICS is focused on ensuring accuracy and inclusion of Jews and Jewish history in all 50 states, and we're monitoring developments related to education policy, like state social studies standards. I'll say more about that in a second, but I want to note that for support on the legislative and advocacy front, JCRCs and Federation colleagues have really earned their battle scars, whether on ethnic studies or Christian nationalism, and they can provide peer support and share the lessons learned, as Jeremy did and as other colleagues will and can do. So, I want to just acknowledge in this room some real warriors in this regard. Ethan in Minnesota, Boston JCRC, Texas Federations, San Francisco JCRC, and many others. Second, if it's possible, try to keep an eye out on legislative developments. A lot of legislation dies, and not all of it has enormous impact on classroom instruction. But by identifying what's brewing early on and drawing on relationships held by lay leaders or professionals in your community, you can sometimes help steer things in a better direction. And if you see that there's a bill that's coming that seems to be touching on any of these issues in education, but you're not sure what to look for, please feel free to reach out. And I'm sure there's others here who can also assist. For smaller communities with overstretched professionals, you might find a passionate lay leader or two that really wants to keep an eye out on and support community legislative advocacy. Third, if your state is going through a state standards process, ICS will reach out to you, and we'll work collaboratively with a coalition of major Jewish organizations from your state. The good news is that ICS will do the heavy lift of analyzing the content and writing up specific recommendations, which we will then share with you for your input and approval. Our view is that while we know where to look and how to calibrate arguments for different audiences, and just as a spoiler alert, the state boards of education in Texas and California are not the same and don't resonate with the same arguments. You all know your states much better than we do and can bring to the fore more nuances and arguments, or even sometimes speak to what we should even bother raising or not. Fourth, I just want to say that it's, I think, really important, something everybody can do, is to encourage Jewish parents of public school students to get involved proactively and positively in their children's schools. Not everyone is going to want to run and be on a local school board, but there's a lot that parents can do to get sort of civically involved in the life of the public schools. I think that's meaningful as citizens, but it's also pragmatic, because involved parents know what is happening, are more connected to decision making, and when they speak up, they're more likely to be heard, because they will be seen as allies and insiders who care about their schools. There's really so much more to do, and I'm not going to get into it now, but happy to talk later about professional development, and ICS has educators that support professional development across the country, so we're happy to help there as well. But please feel free to reach out. And I just want to kind of conclude by saying the stakes of ensuring accuracy and inclusion of Jewish identity, history, and experience really lie in the tens of millions of American K-12 students, including our nation's future college students and leaders. So, thank you.
Before we go to our next scenario, just a really quick question. The You experienced in California some of the challenges of often the Jewish community, everyone working towards a similar goal, but often at odds with each other. What advice do you give to the community about how to manage and work together and not in efforts, and what did you learn from the California experience or elsewhere that you can advise others?
Thank you. Well, so I think everybody here knows that there's no pope in the Jewish community, and so we don't all speak with one voice. But I think it's also important to remember that when we're engaging with education officials, state departments of education, they don't always look at or recognize the nuances within the Jewish community. And sadly, I guess this is really reflective of anti-Semitism, but they will just sort of see us all as the Jews. So I think that's just a thing to be aware of. In terms of, there's a lot of lessons learned on ethnic studies in California, and that could be a different panel. But I would say there's a couple things. I think one is really trying to bring together a coalition of what I would call the mainstream. There's going to be organizations that are really not sort of aligned, and that is something that I think was very effective in California. I've seen the effectiveness of that sort of the coalition of the Jewish federations in Texas, a really amazing group of professionals coming together to talk and to strategize and to recognize that not every organization uses the same tactics, but at least if we're talking and can sort of speak about what is going on and what approaches we're using, hopefully people are not acting at cross purposes and sort of undermining the larger goal, which I think everybody shares, which is not wanting anti-Semitism and not wanting to see Jews excluded or denigrated, or Israel denigrated in education. So.
Okay, scenario 2. Emily, a school in town has had multiple anti-Semitic issues and has failed to respond in a way that feels adequate to the community. A social studies class is in the middle of a unit that touches on discrimination and minority experiences, and the teacher comes to you to discuss a situation. The teacher explains to you that during the introduction to the unit, they asked students to share their experiences with discrimination and exclusion, but when a Jewish student began to talk about their experiences with anti-Semitism, one of the other students responded saying that Jews are white and they shouldn't be speaking over other people in a conversation like this. Another teacher is a member of Jewish Voices for Peace. They target Israeli and Jewish kids in discussions in class. The school community service office has an End the Genocide in Gaza sign on the wall, a violation of classroom neutrality law. How can the community engage and respond?
Hi, guys. Nice to see you all. I see so many people I haven't seen in a long time. I swim in somewhat different waters than my friends here, in that I don't work on curriculum. I'm happy to introduce new curricula, but that isn't our primary focus. My work is largely in crisis response, in culture problems, in sort of level setting for students. And one of the biggest things we do is try to help our community develop some measure in terms of what we're looking at. So the reason we bring this example, this is based on a school I'm currently dealing with. And based on these examples, you'd think we would have a contentious relationship with the administration, right? We've got a JVP teacher who's actually significantly worse than this makes it sound. We have students being targeted. We have classmates harassing each other. We actually had a teacher at the same school burst into tears to her students and offer them a petition to condemn Israel while wearing a Free Palestine shirt. It was an environmental science class. It's totally relevant, right? And all of these things are unfolding, and at the same time, the community, thank God, is coming to us and saying, what should we do? Most of the parents know. They can come to JOF. We have this unusual department, this Israel Education Center, that doesn't mostly do Israel education anymore. We mostly do crisis response. And say to us, what now? And in this case, and in many cases, we try to start small. A lot of people here have kids, right? You can't start yelling, because then you have nowhere else to go. You have to start somewhere smaller. And our first ask of any school in a crisis situation, and I should say as a tangent, we're pragmatists by nature in our work. There's a lot of theory I could get through with you, and we could talk for days. But realistically, people need steps. We need to know what to do to calm a situation and maintain a relationship. If we come at a school in this situation and just start screaming, right? Every email is going to every member of the board and the superintendent and the principals and the whole community. Every member of the press has been called. The police are called. No superintendent in that situation is going to take your call. One, you're now a liability because the law is involved, police are involved, probably lawyers are involved, and they know better than to speak in that case. But two, there's nowhere to go from there. So if things do escalate and things get worse, you don't have a next step because you've been hysterical, I mean in a technical sense, not hysterical like in a denigrating sense, over something that didn't involve violence, which unfortunately is actually a part of the scale of incidents we're facing. So in this particular case with this school that I'm trying really hard not to name by accident, we've worked hard from the first incident we learned of to build a really close relationship with the administration. Even with everything going on, we wanted him to understand that he wasn't our enemy, he was our ally, and we were in it together to make his school better. Right? We want the school to be great. Now, a lot of the kinds of issues we see unfold in high schools are coming through what I will use as shorthand as sort of the DEI office, DEI practices, whatever. Well, hold on, we'll see how this turns. But the DEI office and programs are not our enemy. And I understand there's a huge movement in our community, or a gaining movement in our community, to declare DEI a failure for Jews and dangerous to our community. I understand the impulse, I do. And when we say the whole sentence, DEI is failing us because it's only serving black and brown students, we're saying serving black and brown students is inherently not enough, and because we're not in that list, we should cancel the whole thing even though students have been helped. It's not what anyone means to say, but that's how it sounds to everyone else. So what we come to the school and say is we understand this program exists, we understand it's serving a lot of students in your school. We want to help you include Jews in your vision of a diverse and inclusive school environment. We want to help you root out anti-Semitism. We want your staff to be great and your school to be great so that all of your students feel included and you don't feel like you're alienating or isolating someone, but you're also not taking away the supports that have helped to close an educational gap in a community where that's very serious. I mean, it's serious everywhere, but in this place particularly. So we go to the superintendent, we tell him this. And I say, listen, this meeting is off the record, this is discreet. And it's true to this day. We're not gonna quote this person anywhere. We're not gonna say what his, frankly, sometimes very naive questions were. And we're gonna work hard together. Over the last year, and it's only been 1 year with this guy, we've become close enough now that he's texting me at 10 o'clock at night to let me know if he hears of incidents at other schools, right? The school's not perfect yet, but he's aware of what the problems are. He can recite chapter and verse, and I'm gonna use foul language, I apologize, but I am gonna directly quote this. He looked at me one day and said, Emily, if there's no room for Zionists in my school, that's fucked up. Right? And this was a superintendent at a school with these problems. Thank you. And he felt comfortable enough to say that. He feels comfortable now that he understands what Zionism is and what Jews are. And now he and I are partners against the people that are causing problems. Is it going slower than I want? Of course. It's a school. It's bureaucracy. It's a public government, functionally. There are union issues and employment issues and actual legalities to work through. The First Amendment is robust, thank God. And teachers actually don't enjoy a lot of First Amendment protections in the public school classroom at the high school level. At the university level is a different story, and we could have it, I wasn't in that session, and they covered that beautifully. But the first thing really is to form these relationships. So one of the tools we've started, and I'll touch on this and you can ask me anything, we started running what we call Administrator Symposia on Antisemitism. We want to invite the leaders of our high schools into the Federation when there isn't a problem. It does no good to call someone in the middle of a crisis and all you do is pick up the phone and say, do you know how badly you're failing? Who takes that call a second time? Right? It's a fool me once kind of situation. So instead, we've started running symposia, sometimes in partnership with Project Shema, sometimes we do the education ourselves, it depends on what the schedule is, bringing in also K-12 civil rights attorneys who don't work for advocacy organizations, it's essential to this work. We bring them to the Federation, say, listen, or invite them and say, we're going to teach you about the impact on Jews, we're also going to teach you about the protections for you as an institution, and create a situation where you can discreetly brainstorm with other administrators on how you can protect Jews as an institution. And guess what? They're so hungry for it, we've held 3 since June at their request. We've had dozens of school districts come through them, well over a dozen superintendents, principals, vice principals, communications people we don't talk to enough, and we should. They're the ones writing the statements. When you get a bad statement, it's not the superintendent's fault. It's not even really the fault of the comms person, but they're the one who didn't ask the right question. We invite them in, and from these symposia, they come first. It's a 6-hour day, guys. This is not a short day for anybody. Hard to get that much time. Absolutely across the board, they have looked at us at the end and said, I can't believe this day flew by. Thank you so much. I don't know how you got my contact information. It was Google. Guys, these are public officials. I'm not sure how they didn't put that together, but fine. Very educated until it comes to the internet. And they thank us. And now I've got an entire cohort of supers who text me and email me when they have an incident in their own schools. I'm not ferreting it out. They tell me. They're accountable to themselves now. And we have an open door to communicate. We had a state golf tournament held on Yom Kippur. Superintendent brought it to me and said, I have a student who's hurt by this. What do I do? We were able to get it moved. He couldn't. He tried for 6 months to get it moved. We were able to help. So the partnership that you can form is essential. But coming for the school as a failed state, accusing them of failing because DEI is extremely successfully serving only some students, these are not things that are going to ingratiate us with the rest of the community. And so with this work, with this scenario, the first thing the Federation and lay leaders can do is invest in a personal relationship of curiosity with the school leadership. Find out what's moving them and find out ways you can help and support their goals before you start demanding they fix things.
I'm hearing a lot also about the importance of language in those discussions, and I just also want to point, ADL has done some recent research about some message testing about what language resonates and what doesn't. They have a do's and don'ts, and I would encourage people to look at that because some of it's not quite intuitive. I'm going to move us forward just so that we have time to talk, if that's okay, although there are many, many questions. Okay, you ready? The last scenario. Okay. A Jewish teacher in a local public school attends a rally for Israel and posts an image on Facebook showing her holding an Israeli flag. Students revolt. They protest her class and form a mob, chasing her through the school, yelling that she is a genocidal Zionist. Fearing for her safety, she hides in a closet. How can we address this and similar situations involving student discipline and anti-Israel issues? Desmond?
Oh, great, me, right? That was a lot. I started reading about this scenario in the papers about a week before I got a call, right? And it was during Thanksgiving week when I started reading about it, and it was happening in a place that I'm familiar with, the New York City Department of Education, where I'd previously worked. And so I'm reading the headlines. The Monday morning after Thanksgiving, I get a call from the Deputy Chancellor, a longtime colleague and friend, asking, Desmond, can you guys help? First of all, do you know what happened in Queens, Hillcrest High School, and can you help? My first response was no. We can't help, or we won't help. And my response was that way because having an insight to the way things operate in school systems, my fear was that you were responding to the latest headlines. You were not realizing that what happened on that day took years, maybe even longer, to create, and will take years, perhaps even longer, to rule out. And so I didn't want to be a part of a Band-Aid, right? So my immediate response was no. He begged and groveled, and no, he didn't. But I said, now, if you're willing to understand that it didn't just start that day, it didn't start on 10/7, it started years ago, and the only way to root this out is to take a long-term approach, because I do believe in the power of education. I believe in the power of adolescent minds and recreating their own spaces and also recreating a future for all of us, right? Like, I just believe in it. I spent almost 30 years doing it. I really believe in it. But you got to do it. And if you're going to take this on, it can't be at Hillcrest High School. This is not a one-school issue, okay? And unfortunately, I'll say, you have the news at your disposal because you're watching Columbia University just to your north. You're watching NYU just to your center-south, right there in Manhattan. You're watching this happen in front of you with young adults. And these are the slightly older siblings of the children you have in your schools, right? And so, like, the problem is much bigger than one 2,000 student high school in Queens. Are you ready to take all of that on? And it was affirmed that they were, so we dove in. And the first thing we did was organize an opportunity for us to present ourselves to each and every secondary high school principal in the entire city of New York, right? So ended up being close to 900 principals. We wanted some other person. In some schools, it was the assistant principal. In some schools, it was like a curriculum facilitator or a lead teacher. We wanted at least 2 people in every middle and high school that can move forward and do what they've been petrified to do, and that is talk. More importantly than talk, listen. Okay, youngsters are saying something, and they're pre-wired to think about what is right versus what is wrong. They're pre-wired to think about them having voice and agency, much more so than I was at their age. I was just doing what I was told, right? I didn't think I had voice or agency. But our youngsters, our young adults, our adolescents are pre-wired to do that. So we were able to launch this effort across the entire city. We started in April, and we're still working on some aspects of it to this day. We've gotten feedback now from the New York City Department of Education where of the 1,800 individuals who were trained to then go out and facilitate conversations within their buildings so that other teachers can facilitate conversations among students. That's happened in 92% of the schools that we trained, right? Now, separate from that, what I said to Dan on the phone that day and turned out to be true, having spent time as a school leader and superintendent in Florida, this doesn't happen by itself. In my humble opinion, there was an absolute breakdown in fundamental leadership of that building by way of the principal. I didn't know the principal, but I've been a principal, I've been a superintendent. There's just no, I almost said the word you said. There's just no way. You did, but you did it, so I don't think I have to do it again. But there's just no, what she said, way that 15, 16, and 17-year-old children storm a school that I'm the principal of. That just doesn't happen, or any other active educator in their lives. And so I said, Dan, I don't know who she or he is. I just know that person has to go. And I also know that you have union issues and stuff like that, but like that person can't stay. Okay. Now, fortunately, and I wasn't the only one who felt this way, but again, understanding what I know about school systems, they had the headlines there. They had to do something immediate. They needed to demonstrate to stakeholders that they're reaching out to organizations for support. So they did all that kind of stuff. But this isn't going to take root with that leadership. So that leadership did change, and that work is happening across the entire city. And I wish I could tell you that since 10/7, New York City Department of Education is the only school system where we fielded that kind of call. It actually wasn't. It actually hasn't been. There are school systems where scenarios have ended in brutal violence. Fortunately, gun violence. Fortunately, this particular teacher was whisked away and was being held in an assistant principal's office during this whole event. Physically, she was not harmed. As you can imagine, emotionally, it was horrific, right? Those were her babies. I mean, that's how teachers feel about 16, 17, 18, those are her babies, and I totally get that. And so we're able to do that, and we are now moving forward. Our work is done with about 130 or 40,000 teachers per year, and I recall getting requests from people throughout our network during that time was like, well, Desmond, if like Facing History is working, like why is this happening? Why are we seeing this on the news? And we're speaking of higher ed really erupting during that moment, right? So, well, here's the challenge, right? So we're working right now with about 130, 140,000 teachers per year, English language arts and history at the secondary level, and that's a lot. The challenge is the opportunity is around 1.5 million teachers just in the continental United States of America, language arts and history. And so we need to get ourselves working with and partnering with those teachers rapidly, and we need to do so via our relationships with district leaders. This has got to become a priority. And when I say priority, this has got to be the first 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 things that a school system leader is thinking about. This needs to go on the weekly, monthly scorecard or mention among the executive team, and something that is reported out regularly to a school board and or legislatures. Speaking of which, we did a landscape analysis, and I was horrified by what I found. History is really important. So our whole model is using what we call hard history, genocide, Holocaust, slavery, and we unpack how those episodes occurred, and we use those very moments in order to educate children to not see repeat in those situations, right? And it works beautifully. And so to find out that of all states in our nation, only 27, I believe, states had legislation that required Holocaust education in their school system. That's bad. What's worse than that, only 4 of the 27 states were even funding the opportunity. That's horrific, okay? And so as of August 2024, this past summer, only 4 of those 27 states and the rest of the states were not even legislatively requiring the instruction in their schools. And I just, for one, think that needs to be beefed up significantly. So right away, wherever you are, wherever you're going home to today or tomorrow, I mean, your school board, of course, your state legislation, they need phone calls, at least. Thank you.
So I had 2 questions for you. One I think you partially answered, but I'm going to ask it again. But so one is, why isn't this education everywhere? Meaning, what is that? What are the barriers, and why aren't we seeing everyone opening their doors to Facing History or one of the many providers out there? And then the other, which because can't ask this question enough, what does good look like? So when you think about the New York work that you're doing, in the end, what do you expect or want to see to know that you've actually had an impact?
Well, the last question is, I mean, you have to see a significant reduction, if not the elimination, of racialized episodes of hatred happening in schools. I mean, that just, in most schools or in states that are actually measuring this, right? Or episodes of bullying or other hatred where the impetus is some type of religious belief, okay? That has to be measured and eliminated. Your first question was?
Why isn't this everywhere? Why is everyone not working?
I wish, I'm thinking about her word over there.
I'm so happy I introduced that for us.
You can also answer that.
It has, I'm going to get a little accusatory here. It has conveniently been left off the map, okay, if you want my honest opinion there. Going back to our scholarship and going back to the beginning of the Holocaust, where the most problematic thing that was happening was the allowed othering of human beings. because the human beings were a very small percent, less than 2 or 3% of a population, it was very, very easy for overwhelmingly most of us to look at those people and allow ourselves not to care. Okay? And we're allowing that to happen today. Okay, and so, not to mention the legislative pieces I articulated has to be addressed, and we just can't allow what I'll call like othering to take place.
Do you want to? Yeah.
Hi, I'll say it again. Fucked. No, okay. I was asked. Sorry. So when we think about good, it's similar, right? So I think because of my position on the crisis side and your position, thank God that it's not mine, on the coming around institution on the policy curricula side, which we don't have the capacity for, so we're deeply grateful to have partners who are focusing in that area. Our version of good is when I'm not getting calls, which is very similar, right? So there are fewer incidents, but it also means the school is handling their own incidents, right? If it doesn't make it to my desk, that's usually because the school is getting it right. It feels satisfying to the students, feels satisfying to the parents. The community feels more secure. They can trust the institution to do what it should. And in terms of how did we get to here, one of the other talks we give is literally just a straight training about anti-Semitism. And if we look pre-October 7th, thank you to the ADL for the surveying, 20% of Americans hold anti-Semitic attitudes. That's 69 million Americans. That's 11 anti-Semites for every Jew in the United States. Yeah, so never underestimate the fact that we are actually a tiny, tiny, tiny minority, right? We see ourselves, our names are all over, we donate, we're public, we're vigorous, we're so engaged. When I give these trainings in anti-Semitism, and I say this for context, the number one thing, and I'm sorry for my colleagues who are here have to hear me say this for the 9,000th time, the number one thing we get backlash to, and this is a training that has a map of Israel in it, granted it's a goofy one, which is good, but we talk about Zionism, we talk about anti-Zionism, we talk about all the hard stuff. The number one thing people get very angry about is when I note that Jews don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. This is shocking to us, right? We feel like this is the obvious piece. But what it illustrates for me and reminds me every year, people don't know anything about Jews. I don't necessarily fault them for it. Their educational systems failed them too. But it does show the gulf between when we hear there's an incident to asking the school to do something, that there's some education in here, right? There's space for us to help the schools get to where they need to be able to respond. And helping bridge those gaps organizationally is critical, but we can't wait for institutions to solve it. We as institutions need to empower, and I mean through trainings, I mean like literal stuff like how do you write a good email trainings, empower the parents in our community, the leaders in our community to help us advocate. 11 anti-Semites per Jew. We can't rely on our institutions alone to do this. You can't rely on us to be able to reach every one of 1.5 million teachers in the United States. And so the more lay leadership and community empowerment we lean into, the stronger we're going to be in general.
Can I say something about good? Just to add, one of the ways we look at good in through a number of lenses, but sort of a very simple one that I can share is that based on the collaborative work, just as one example, that we did with our Federation partners in Texas, 36 out of 37 of the recommendations we made to the English language arts K-5 instructional materials that were really promoting sort of Christian nationalism were accepted. And so the example that's quoted in the case study is not there anymore. So and it works, and it looks like not only sort of correcting bias and inaccuracies in textbooks and in instructional materials and in what teachers teach, but also deepening and enriching what is taught. Holocaust education is obviously very critically important, and I would add that equally important, and maybe I'm a little biased on this, even perhaps more important, is for people to understand who Jews are and the reality of living Jews today, and that anti-Semitism didn't sadly end with the Holocaust, but is here and manifests in different forms still.
And I'll just add, we have this language at Facing History where we talk about certainly victims, but we also talk about upstanders. okay? And how we sow seeds to help children become upstanders, and how we make that personal. We mentioned DEIB and some of the challenges with DEIB. Well, one of the challenges is where we have not included our Jewish brothers and sisters in the terminology around DEIB, largely because of pigmentation. Largely because there's a misunderstanding of who Jews are, and that you cannot be characterized by pigmentation. The other thing we have to do with privilege, and I say our, because it's understanding that as a Christian myself, I need to become one with some of the Christian roots of anti-Semitism, okay, and also be a voice of that. Leveraging privilege to be able to say things in rooms that not everyone is able to say without like immediate and gross backlash, right? Which totally understand. So in any way, shape, or form, teaching children that when you have some privilege, and I think we all do, because I think privilege is an episodic thing. It isn't fixed. Some people have, and I never have. It depending on situation and circumstances. I absolutely have privilege, right? And when that happens, we have to dig into ourselves and leverage our own privilege.
So the good news is that there is a large and growing body of curricula or content around who Jews are, Jewish history, Israel, everything in addition to contemporary anti-Semitism. And so the question really, for me as I'm listening to the three of you is how do we understand which are the best or which work the best, and then how do we get it out into the system and then support it at the local level, the professionals who are trying to do this good and important work. We were going to break out into groups, but given the size of the audience, I'm going to ask if people would prefer. I always wanted to be Phil Donahue, not really, but in his memory, if people would prefer to ask some questions of the panelists. Does that work for everyone? Okay, great. So I think we only have one mic, so we'll kind of do a back end. There you go. Yeah.
First of all, thank you to all of you. Incredibly informative. So this is a complete failure of leadership, and I'm curious to know, how do the school boards, where are the PTAs, and what can we do to get them engaged? Because this should never be happening if there's proper oversight.
Well, any school board members in here? Don't raise your hand. Okay, don't self-identify. I will tell you, in secret society superintendent training that I've been a part of in my past, literally, no matter how small or ginormous a school system is, things come down to literally 10 or 15 people at a board meeting with the same colored shirts on, with something written across the front, and committed to advocating for a thing. Those people have to start showing up in school board meetings across the nation with a specific message. We've seen this tactic work, and work really, really well with beliefs and pushes that we don't always agree with. But the method is foolproof. The method is foolproof. As a former superintendent, I would often activate members of my community and say, hey, listen, I need to see you come down to the boardroom, and I need to see you speak and demonstrate that the community is behind a certain initiative if you are. And it's amazing how the people who you wanted to speak, who you wanted to see have agency, they would come and they would sit in the board meeting, and I'd go, board meeting ended, you didn't talk. And I'd meet with them after. Why didn't you say anything? Oh, Doc, we didn't want to offend you. I'm like, no, offend me. Because I need you to offend me here when I'm with my board, so my board sees this as a problem and then directs me to do something about it. Like, I need that to happen. And again, so many people have so many pet issues who, quite frankly, I may or may not agree with, but they're in the room and they're asking the questions and they're putting the heat and the pressure on the system to do something. We the people.
I mean, very, very similarly. Hi, John. We are currently developing trainings for community members to do things like attend board meetings. One thing we found is we recommend it, and then no one has any idea what happens at a civil meeting. The Jewish community is incredible and strong and organized and has also largely focused our energy on the federal level and less focus, not none, but less focus on the hyperlocal. Your village council, the school board, the PTA, museum boards, by the way, are also a mess. There's a board that is federally supported or civically supported that we need to be in the room at every institution. But in terms of school boards, we need to have our community members speak up. It's inconvenient, and we need to name that. I have spoken to more groups now and said, listen, if you carve out 3 of the hours a month out of the entire month you spend online and go to your board meeting, the dividends will be immense. We have to be in the room because otherwise, if we're not at the table talking with them, we're being talked about, right? It's like if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. You guys know this phrase? It's fundamentally the case. Anti-Semitic, anti-Israel activists have figured out how local governance works. They show up. They show up loud, they show up demanding. Right now on my own kid's school board, there's a 25-year-old, 24-year-old, who I dealt with as an anti-Israel activist when she was in college. I mean, dealt with professionally. Now she's on my kid's school board because she has political ambitions. And this was an easy place to get elected because no one was running. Now my husband is. Not sure if it was his idea. We'll see. He'll be great. It's going to be good. But the point is that everybody can do it. He isn't political. But we need parents and community members who care about the schools and who have a stake in their district to show up and be a part of these institutions or at least show up for comment.
I will never grow hair again because of this tactic, but it works.
Maybe we can take 2 or 3 questions if they're short, and then.
There are many dimensions where anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic sentiments can be shared. I'd be interested in your thoughts in terms of the settler colonialist notion of Zionism as if Jews only showed up in Palestine in 1947. And how do you bring that historical context into play so that people understand that the Jews are the indigenous population of Palestine, they're not the colonialist settlers?
Maybe we ask a couple, but I am going to probably say that Elise is going to point you to the ICS website to learn. But let's take a couple of others, and then we can.
I just want to say you're all so amazing. Thank you so much for all you do and all the information that you're giving us. Would you mind taking 1 minute to give me a little bit of information on what to do in a private school when there's anti-Semitism?
Right, okay.
Hi, I'm Bob Hornstein, the Jewish community relations professional in Portland. You know, Jeremy, when you were talking about Boston, I thought maybe you were talking actually about Portland because it's so much familiarity. So, you know, like we've done all the right things, the relationships with superintendents, with school boards, with the Department of Education. The latest challenge, though, as Eliza knows, is teachers' conferences, social studies, humanities teachers. So in just a couple weeks ago, on a Saturday, always on Shabbat, of course, you've got this organization, which is national, so it may be coming to your community, the Rethinking Schools, which is very credible when it comes to educators, but has a very distinct anti-Israel bent. And so you've got, in this conference that happened in Seattle, for about 500 teachers from Oregon and Washington. You've got a keynote, a highlight of three panelists. One is JVP, one is the originator of the problematic ethnic studies from California, and the other one is a teacher from Portland who's teaching the so-called curriculum Teach Palestine, which is just anti-Zionist revisionist history. So we're sort of at a loss, and I'm just wondering, any suggestions of how to address the conferences?
Great. So we have three questions, and I would just encourage if there are things we can answer here versus offline. One is, how do you handle the conversation about settler colonialist thinking related to Israel? Another is, how do we think about private schools? And there are some organizations, by the way, that are specifically focused on private, or I think the euphemism now is independent schools, right? And then teacher conferences. How do we deal with the kind of influx of anti-Israel educators and voices around those tables?
So with regards to the first question, I think that actually the example I shared at the beginning about including ancient Israel and teaching about ancient civilizations was important both because of accuracy and using the right terminology for the right time periods in history, but I actually think it actually goes to your question very precisely, because when students learn about ancient Israel and that civilization, they learn way before you get to high school in modern world history, you learn about the Jewish people's indigeneity, if you will, and deep connections to the land of Israel. So I think that's one piece of it. And then I think it's also through history and social studies classes where you are not just looking at the current specific conflicts that are happening, but you're looking at the historical roots and the connections that the different peoples in the region have to the land. So that's what I would say about that. The second one was about independent schools. I'll let someone else take that. Okay. Okay. Do we want to
I can do private schools. What do we do about private schools? Well, one of the things that we've found is that private schools and federations frequently share donors. And I'm not saying you start there with, well, I mean, you start with the conversation. I'm not saying you start with activating them. But one of the very first things that I recommend before there's a problem, preferably, but it's okay if that's where you're starting, map out who supports what schools, who's sending their kids to what schools. Have an environmental survey, and I don't mean the plant kind of environmental, of your community. We do this with universities, we do this with the private schools, we do this with all kinds of institutions. Just understand who cares about what. From there, you approach the private schools initially the same way you approach the public schools. These are well-intentioned people, they want to educate students, and they want to do a good job of it, and they aren't trying to hurt anyone. Sometimes you find out they don't mind that they're hurting students. They don't mind. It's a cost of doing business to advocate a certain kind of body politic. From there, you can activate parents. Parents who have the kids there, who may be part of your federation or local Jewish community, have them initiate the conversation with the school. The more we can empower the community of the school itself to advocate, the better off we are. Ideally, the federations, the JCRCs, come in as the heavy or as the educational partner. You want the parents to be able to make the big change because they're the long-term residents of the building. However, it doesn't always work. We have one school in Chicago in particular that is renowned for the quality of its education, and it's gotten to be so dire that after 60 Jewish parents formed a group together, they were unable to move the school. Okay, then we invite the administrators to our trainings. Didn't help. Okay, then we start pressing the school. Can't get them to budge, and now they've lost multiple seven-figure gifts at the school. One of the things we suggest, if that's a direction your community is interested in, and in front of all of you and my own boss, I'm telling you, I'm not suggesting necessarily this is what you do. But if it's something people are interested in doing, pulling gifts to make a difference, which works sometimes at universities and privates, rather than donating $0, donate $1. A donation of $0 shows up as a skip, right? We don't, oh, they must have missed a year, and no one looks up. You donate $1 after your last gift was 12 million, someone's going to call and find out why, if they're paying attention, and they probably are, right? So that is what we recommend in those situations. Start small, get the parents going, have the students file the bias reports through the appropriate channels. The Clery Act mandates that they have to report those. Don't skip it just because it doesn't work, but work the other channels first.
Can I just add one quick thing?
Yeah, please.
Also, the teachers who are teaching in private schools, social studies and history, those are teachers who go to educator conferences. Those are teachers who seek professional development. And so, there are many organizations, including us, including my colleagues here and around the room, that offer professional development for those teachers as well.
More acutely, I had no idea I was going to betray everything I learned in secret society superintendent school today, but media plus money equals motivation, okay? So these teachers that are going away to conferences, I travel all the time for work, so that's not cheap. There's a plane ticket somewhere in there, there's a hotel stay somewhere in there, there's transportation to and from, there are a lot of expenses. 10, 15 teachers go to a place and we're talking a 20 grand bill minimum. Public records request in that school system for the dollars being spent to go to these conferences, and the question, what is the academic ROI on these dollars being spent, will inspire school boards and superintendents to, one, just pay more attention just because, okay? But now that we've been motivated to pay attention just because, now there's also calling to the carpet a particular setting that we spent X number of dollars on, and how can you, school system, justify the narrative that was delivered here, and how that's consistent to, a fully functioning democratic society that we want to be proud of. I mean, I'd like to say, and this is not speaking disparagingly, those folks are busy, and oftentimes the emergency of the day is what's driving the reaction of the day. And so we have to energize some interests. And I say that to you as a fellow citizen.
So I've spent a lot of time in the past year on K-12, and I learned so much from this session, so I hope you all did too. Really, really incredible. Thank you, and thank you for, I think, how it was structured and organized by JFNA in particular made it so valuable. I think as follow-up, it's important to note that hopefully you'll start to see some more information come out, particularly the mapping and this organizing of providers and an opportunity to tap in and learn from each other. So stay tuned, and I'm sure you'll hear from JFNA, among others, where to get that information. So thank you very much.